Thank you, Scott. Appreciate your ministry. Appreciate you worshiping with all the ducks and car alarms. Scott's right. You never know truly what you're going to get. For those of you who haven't figured it out yet, we're on a lake. And since we couldn't get on a big lake, we decided to make some phone calls this past week and ask some family at the church who we knew lived on lakes, could we borrow your backyard? And then even worse, could we borrow your boat? And so we ended up with Greg and Sue Jones. Some of you may know Greg because he's the teacher of the Hood Bible class on Sunday mornings. Some of you may know Greg as an airline pilot, retired airline pilot now. Some of you may know his wife, Sue. And that's how you know the Jones family, because she's involved too at the church. We know them because they live on a lake and for a few other reasons. But so, this past week when we asked Greg if we could borrow his backyard, because we're in John chapter 6 and we're talking about Jesus walking on water, and we're like, we definitely need water, but we can't go to a lake because it's closed down and nobody can put their boat on a lake. And he sends us a picture of his little sailboat, which is not so little. I mean, we could have all squeezed on there. And I was like, how big's that boat? Could we squeeze on that boat and sail around the lake while we're live streaming? And he goes, yeah, I think we could probably do it. Maybe not sailing, maybe paddling. Then he texts me a few hours later and says, actually, I got a couple neighbors that maybe have a bigger boat, and I could go ask them. And so God blessed us with a neighbor who has a good-sized boat that we're live streaming here from right outside Greg and Sue Jones's backyard on their lake with the boat of a friend who also believes in Jesus and is using his brand new boat to serve God this way and allowing us to do this. So we say thanks to them. We say thanks to Greg and Sue for allowing us to be here. We're in John chapter 6. The question is, do you have any friends that have ever tried to walk on water? Maybe. Maybe you'd be surprised to know that I do. He's told me the story one time. I won't mention his name, but he's one of my very best friends, and so I can at least share that much. This passage that we're talking about today, we're not in the book of Matthew, where we get the account of Jesus walking on water and then Peter walking on water too. We're in John's gospel, and it's more specific to just Jesus walking on water. So we're going to stay focused on that today. Some of you may remember from John chapter 5 that Jesus introduces this idea to the Jews, to the crowd that he's talking to, that he is the greater Moses. And I've been just kind of hammering that home in chapter 5, at the end of chapter 5, and then now since we've been in chapter 6. If you were here with us last week, we jumped ahead to John chapter 20, obviously, because of the resurrection and Easter Sunday. And so we're going back now to John chapter 6. We got through the first 14 verses, 3 weeks ago now, and then we did verse 15 2 weeks ago now. And I've been, like I said, just kind of hammering home that Jesus is the greater Moses. And so we've seen example number 1 of Jesus acting in a Moses-like fashion when he feeds the 5,000 plus. And that's example number 1. And then in this story, we're going to see example number 2 and 3. And most people miss the third example in this story. Most people are familiar with Jesus walking on water, but a lot of people miss the third example of Jesus being like Moses in this story. So I'll show it to you as we go. We're coming off of Jesus feeding the 5,000, which is like Moses feeding the people in the wilderness, manna in the morning, quail in the evening. Then Jesus just up and feeds 5,000 people in Moses-like fashion during the Passover time. And the people at the end of the story in verse 15, we saw it last week, or 2 weeks ago, they recognize that Jesus is a prophet. But in their recognition of Jesus being a prophet, they say, he's a prophet, he must also be the king. We want to take him, make him king by force right now. And Jesus, we talked about a couple weeks ago, he understands the timing of God. He understands the process of God. He understands that that's not the time that he needs to be set up as king or how he needs to do it. He needs to die first and then be exalted by God himself. And so he withdraws from the people and he goes to a mountain. And so that's where we pick up the story here in John chapter 6, starting in verse 16. Jesus is withdrawn from the crowd. He's up on a mountaintop. The disciples are waiting for him. They're supposed to head to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and it's getting close to nighttime. So that's where we jump in. John chapter 6, verse 16. This is the word of the Lord. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea and got into the boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. And the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. So Jesus goes up on a mountain, retreats from the crowd, and the disciples are standing there waiting. Maybe they're a little frustrated on multiple occasions at this point. First, there's this crowd of 5,000 people that wants to come and make Jesus king, and the disciples are pretty sure that he's supposed to be king. But instead of going with the people and saying, yes, finally there's a crowd of people that wants to make me king, he retreats. They're probably a little confused by that. Then they're probably a little more confused at why he's somewhere else on a mountain when they're supposed to be getting on the boat and going to the other side of the sea. Either he left them, he went without them, he went before them, he got on a different boat, he forgot to mention that he was going across the sea. Whatever it was, they're probably maybe a little confused at this point. They're probably, maybe some of them are a little frustrated with Jesus. What's he doing? Why is he denying this right now? And why is he leaving us behind? We're supposed to be his disciples. But they get in a boat. They know that the plan was to go to the other side of the sea. So they get in the boat, they go to the other side of the sea. And it says in verse 18 that the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. This is typical. This is typical for the Sea of Galilee. Some of you are familiar with the Sea of Galilee. Some of you, many of you probably, if you're from our church, have been there. You've been on the Sea of Galilee. You may know that the Sea of Galilee is, give or take, 8+ miles wide. So 8+ miles wide, it's kind of like oval shaped, but pretty circular. It's also below sea level, which is why you can get a crazy storm like this to just roll in out of nowhere. That would catch even fishermen who are used to being on this boat off guard. So here's what happens. A sea that's below sea level, the warm air just kind of sits on top of the sea. And so what happens in the Sea of Galilee is that there's a mountain range area that sits right at the southeast of the Sea of Galilee. And so when when cold air comes over that kind of mountaintop, hilltop, if you will, at that point, as soon as it gets over that hilltop, it runs straight down the side and it goes right across the surface of the lake. And what happens is the cold air pushes the warm air, moist air, and it just swirls it all over the place. And all of a sudden you go from no storm, seems kind of nice, kind of hot and sticky on the lake, to all of a sudden there's a raging storm and it's crazy outside. So this is typical for happening on the Sea of Galilee. It's because it sits below sea level. Even today, if you go to Galilee and there's a storm, motorized boats are not even allowed on the Sea of Galilee during storms in that area. So even today, it's the same as it was before. If it's a storm, it's a little bit rough. It's more than just a bit rough. Verse 19 says, where they were on the lake, verse 19, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles out. So I said the Sea of Galilee is give or take 8+ miles wide. So they're 3 or 4 miles in, which means they're basically smack in the middle of the sea. So they row out, they're smack in the middle, give or take any direction, 3 to 5 miles away from the shore, and the storm hits. Why that's important is because the second half of verse 19 says this: they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. So this is the story that everybody's familiar with. This is the one that everybody knows. Jesus walked on the water. And the reason it's important that they rowed out 3 to 4 miles is so that you would know that Jesus didn't just walk off the shore a couple steps. I mean, he had to walk 3-4 miles on the water to get to them in the middle of the lake. This is what we call in the Bible, this theological term for you, escalation. So in the past stories, you may remember from the beginning of John chapter 6, Jesus feeds the 5,000. And we looked at the Old Testament story where Moses calls to God and God sends manna and quail. And in the story, the people cry out to Moses, Moses cries out to God, God sends the food. But in John chapter 6, when the people are hungry, Jesus multiplies the food. He doesn't call out to God. He doesn't say, God, we need you. God, I can't do this on my own. He just does it in God-like fashion. That's what we call escalation in the Bible. Something happens, a similar thing happens later, but to a greater extent. That's what's happening here as well. Most people are familiar with Moses parting the sea. The Passover happens in Egypt. the final plague happens in Egypt. The people of God get up out of Egypt. They go. This is in Exodus chapter 12, 13, 14. They go. And then the Egyptians follow them. And they get stuck. The people of God in the wilderness, they get stuck. They see the Egyptians following them. And they see the sea. And they're looking back going, the Egyptians are looking forward going the sea. And they cry out to God, what do we do now? And you know the story. Moses stretches out his hand and he parts the sea. So if Jesus is trying to act in Moses-like fashion, what would be better than crying out to God and then sticking your hand out or a staff and parting the sea? The escalation would be, I'm just going to up and walk on the water. We don't need to cry out to God. We don't need to do these things. And the reason why is because Jesus is God. That's what I was trying to get you to understand in John chapter 5, which John's gospel is then just pushing in John chapter 6. Let me read this to you from Exodus chapter 14. This is the story that I was talking about. This is the people of God backed up to the sea, Egyptian army behind them. Notice what Moses does by God's command, and then notice what the people's response is, because that's also going to be key. This is Exodus chapter 14, verse 13. Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord that he will provide for you today. For the Egyptians that you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight with you. You can be still. Then in verse 15, the Lord said to Moses, why do you cry out to me? This is the people of God. They're scared. They cry out to Moses. Moses cries out to God. God says to Moses, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. As for you, lift up your staff, extend your hand toward the sea, and divide it, so the Israelites may go through on the middle of the sea on dry ground. And as for me, I'm going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians so they will come after them, that I may be honored because of the Pharaoh and his army and his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I have gained my honor because of the Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. The angel of God who was going before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. So there's a pillar of cloud, angel of the Lord going in front of the people of God. And instead of going in front of them, the angel of the Lord moves to behind the people of God to protect them. Pillar of cloud moved before them and stood behind them. It came between Egyptian camp and the Israelite camp. It was a dark cloud. It lit up the night so that one camp did not come near the other the whole night. Moses then stretched out his hand toward the sea, and the Lord drove the sea apart by a strong east wind all that night. He made the sea into dry land, and the water was divided. And so the Israelites went through the middle of the sea on dry ground, the water forming a wall for them on the right and to the left. So maybe some of you are paying attention to the details of this story. In Exodus, Moses sticks out the staff, but the Lord's the one that divides the sea. Not Moses. He's just doing what God tells him to do. You may also notice that the wind came from the east and divided the sea. Similar fashion, Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, where the wind would come down and create a storm from the east, instead of crying out to God and God parting the sea, he just up and walks on the water. A lot of people read these stories and they want to believe in Jesus and they want to think to themselves, that means we can walk on water. Or they read the Gospel of Matthew and they see Peter walking on the water with Jesus, and they think that these stories are just to show that Jesus is powerful or that we could walk on water like Jesus. But actually the details in the story are trying to show you that for thousands of years, God's been working this out. That the events in Moses' time that God commanded Moses to do were all for the purpose that when Jesus came and walked on water, the Jews at his time and us who are reading it now recorded in John's gospel would get it. We would figure it out. We would see all the details. Listen to the response of the people at the end of this section, still in Exodus chapter 14. The Egyptians chased them, followed them into the middle of the sea, and all the horses and Pharaoh's and his chariots and his horsemen. In the morning, watch the Lord look down on the Egyptian army through a pillar of fire and cloud. He threw the Egyptian army into a panic. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so they would be difficult to drive. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from Israel, for the Lord fights for them against Egypt. Then the Lord said to Moses, extend your hand toward the sea, so that the waters may flow back on the Egyptians and on their chariots and the horsemen. So Moses extended his hand to the sea, and the sea returned to a normal state when the sun began to rise. Now the Egyptians fleeing before it, but the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the middle of the sea. The water returned, covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all of Pharaoh's army that was coming after the Israelites into the sea. Not so many as one of them survived. But Israelites walked on dry ground in the middle of the sea, the water forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. And then the last verse here. So the Lord saved Israel on that day from the power of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great power that the Lord had exercised over the Egyptians, they feared the Lord, and they believed the Lord, and they believed Moses. How many times have I told you that all of John's gospel is written so that you might believe? He's coming up with story after story after story, after example, after sign, he calls them, not just miracles, signs, that Jesus is who he says he is. And the purpose of John making all these is so that you might believe. Fascinatingly, the same response was for the people of God in Moses' time. They saw the power of God, they feared the Lord, and they believed. That's the second example of a sign that Jesus does, that he's like Moses. Let's just get to the third one here real quick, and then we'll talk about how this works for us. So they rowed about 3 or 4 miles out. They saw Jesus walking to the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, that's Jesus, said to the disciples, "It is I, do not be afraid." And then verse 21, here's the last example of Jesus being like Moses that a lot of people miss. And then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land at which they were going. If you're paying attention to the details in the story, when Jesus walked out to them, they were in the middle of the lake, 3 to 4 miles away from the shore. And yet, verse 21 of John's Gospel says, as soon as Jesus walked into the boat, they were immediately at the shore. So that means that Jesus, some disciples, and a boat somehow teleported 3 to 4 miles instantaneously. Or the way John puts it is immediately. A lot of people read past that and they say, isn't it cool? Jesus walked on water. And they miss that Jesus teleported a bunch of people and himself and a boat 3 to 4 miles away, not just like a few steps. And you may say to yourself, why is that important? When we were in John chapter 6, when we talked about feeding of the 5,000, I said it's important when the New Testament is trying to parallel Old Testament passages, it's important to see what's the same, but it's also important to see what's different. So at the end of Jesus feeding the 5,000, I told you what was different was that there was 12 baskets full of food, that Jesus commanded the disciples, gather these baskets, which was different than the Old Testament. When manna and quail were in the wilderness, you gathered what you needed and you left all the rest. And the next day you trusted God for the provision of food and water. But in Jesus' day, when he did the miracle, it was different. And the 12 baskets then symbolized the continuous provision of the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross for all the people of God, the 12 tribes. That would be the symbolism. So here's the story is where it it's where it becomes diverse as well. This part of the story when they go immediately. Some of you may have been paying attention when I read that in Exodus chapter 14, the people of God parted the sea, and then they had to walk from one side of the sea to the other. So there was this path that they had to walk. But what's different in this story is that when the disciples were willing to believe in Jesus and accept him, they were transported immediately to safety. And the question is why? Why do that miracle on top of walking on water? It seems kind of like enough to walk on water that they should get it. But I'm going to suggest to you this. I'm going to suggest to you that the immediate transportation from the middle of the sea, in the middle of danger, to the shore where they were trying to go and out of danger is an image of our immediate salvation that comes when we believe in Jesus Christ. We're immediately transported from a place of danger, a place of condemnation, the wrath of God. We're immediately then transported to restored fellowship with God, to restored relationship with God, from unrighteousness to righteousness instantaneously, from death to life, from broken relationship to restored relationship, from child of wrath, from enemy of God to child of God. I want you to be careful with this, because there are some churches, there are some pastors, there are some that believe that when you put your faith in Jesus, that not only are you physically or spiritually restored, but there's also an immediate physical restoration. In other words, there's people who teach that if you would just become a believer, you would be free of cancer. If you would just become a believer, you would be able to walk again. If you would just become a believer, that mental illness that you struggle with would just immediately go away. I don't think that's what this is saying. When I say that when you become a believer, you're transported out of danger and to the shore, to security, to safety, what I'm saying is you're transported out of the path of the wrath of God and into the path of the salvation of God. The rest of the Bible doesn't support you being physically healed or fully restored physically, mentally, until glorification, until we're in heaven with God. There's just not that promise of us being healed in this life. Now, if you choose to believe in Jesus and God says, I want to heal you today, he can do that. And if he does it, I say, praise God. And if you feel led to pray for that, I say, praise God. What I'm saying is don't get derailed if that doesn't happen. Don't walk down the path of, I'm going to believe in Jesus so that I could be healed, and then get derailed when it doesn't happen. What I'm telling you is that God often uses physical representations to describe spiritual realities. So God's doing these miracles to show the Jews, and then John is recording these miracles to show you and I that when you believe in Jesus, there's this instantaneous moment of going from death to life, where you escape the wrath of God and you are immediately on the shore with God. His righteousness is applied to you immediately. You don't have to work for it. You don't have to be good enough. You just have to go from, I don't know who this is, I'm scared about Jesus, I'm fearful of this guy walking on the water, to, okay, I'm not afraid, I know who he is, and we're going to accept him into the boat. God promises to save, transform your life spiritually, but he doesn't promise full physical, mental restoration until we're in heaven, until the final judgment, until the final glorification. Jesus didn't walk on water so that he could look cool. Didn't walk on water just to show you and I something that we couldn't do. I can do this and you can't. He needs you to understand that he's the greater Moses. Look at all the details, compare the stories, put the pieces together. He needs you to respond like the Israelites did when they saw the power of God. Listen to their response. This is Exodus chapter 14, verse 31. When the Israelites saw the great power that the Lord had exercised over the Egyptians, they feared the Lord, they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. And I think that's the same response that God's trying to get out of us by walking on water and then transporting a boat and some men and himself 3 to 4 miles away. He's trying to get you to fear the Lord. This guy's powerful, way more powerful than I am. To believe in the Lord and to believe in his servant, which in this case is Jesus. He's trying to tell you that he is a servant of God. He's far, far greater than Moses. You should believe in Jesus. You should gain the eternal life. You should gain the eternal security. And you should have confidence that God has saved you in that. If you're not a believer, starts trying to figure out what to do with Jesus. There was this guy recorded in the Bible. He walked on water. Don't know what you do with that. He teleported himself, disciples, and a boat 3 to 4 miles instantaneously. Got to figure out what to do with that. God told humanity that he would come thousands of years before he came. And then he came. He did miracles so that people could see. He had John the Apostle write down these miracles so that you and I would have them thousands of years later. Don't dismiss the miracles. Wrestle with them. Ask yourself if what I'm saying is true. You figure it out for yourself. If you're a believer, I hope that your faith is strengthened. I hope that you see that God's been working out this plan of salvation for thousands of years. I hope that when you're trying to figure out what's God going to do with my finances, or the job that I don't have right now, or my family that's running amok because they're all trapped in this tiny little space together, and you're trying to figure out how's God possibly going to work out all these details, that you look at this story and you realize that for thousands of years, God has been orchestrating people's lives and details and money and location and time and space. And if he can orchestrate your salvation over thousands of years and multiple people, then there's no reason that he can't get a hold of your family or your finances or the job that you don't have right now. I hope that this story is a way of strengthening your faith. I hope that you can walk away from this story resting in the peace of God. It's so much more than just, wow, Jesus walked on water. It's, wow, Jesus walked on water to show you and I that he's the promised one of God, that they have been working out this plan, that you can trust him, and that the plan is perfect, that you can rest in that, have peace in that. I want you to walk away not questioning your salvation, knowing that if you believed truly, genuinely, that instantaneously he gave you the right to become a child of God. Pray with me, and I'll give you a couple more announcements, and then we'll be done for today. God, we say thanks for people in our church who are willing to let us come in their backyard, even though we're in isolation, and walk through their back gate to try to keep everyone safe. God, I say thanks for neighbors that are willing to let us use their boat. God, I ask that you would bless our friend who's letting us sit on his boat, who's captaining for us right now. God, I ask that you would bring comfort to Greg and Sue, who are trying to deal with having lost Greg's mother when all this quarantine has happened and they weren't able to be there with her. God, it shows the true heart of a man who's willing to, even in the midst of trying to figure out a difficult time of grieving, would still reach out to accomplish your work. So God, I ask you to comfort Greg and Sue and bless them, draw close to them, and help them just to stay connected to you. God, for all of us who are trying to figure out how to trust you during this time, I pray that we would remember that you're the God that walks on water. You're the God who has been working out this plan for us for thousands of years. We don't have any reason to question you. We have no reason to wonder whether or not you're powerful enough, big enough, or strong enough. God, I pray for marriages right now that you would draw them closer together, not push them farther apart, even though we're physically, proximity, probably much closer together. God, don't let marriages deteriorate more than we've already seen them. Help couples find a way to relearn how to communicate, relearn how to connect. Draw them closer together. Strengthen marriages during this time. Don't let them fall apart. God, I pray you would continue to help us to outreach the people that we know, our neighbors. Share with them about who you are and that they should believe. God, for people who are wrestling with you this morning and multiple days, who are just randomly tuning in on Facebook, God, I pray you would touch their lives. Show them who you are. Make yourself real to them. Make it impossible for them to deny you or to say no. God, we thank you that you are who you say you are. We thank you that you showed us these stories in the Bible. Thanks for preserving your word so that we can read it and know who you are. God, we ask that you would sustain us during this time, and as you have been, we thank you. We pray all this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.